Okay, today I get to speak with someone kind of new to me. His name's Stephen Ruppenthal, and he reached out to me to just describe a new work that he was doing, which is a CD project. I got a copy, and I really loved it, but beyond that, it made me realize that it kind of hit a really neat point between a lot of the stuff that we generally think of as electronic music and the kind of stuff I run into in my work life, which is the electroacoustic world, the world that is occupied by Seamus and a lot of academics that I also love. And so this was an opportunity for me to interview somebody to talk about the differences, the influences that one has had on the other, and just to talk about like a different part of the electronic music world. So with that, I'm going to say hello to Stephen. Hey, Stephen, how's it going?
It's going well, Darwin. Thanks for initiating this. This is great.
Well, thank you for reaching out, and thanks for sharing your CD. Like I said, I found it really enjoyable, really fantastic. Why don't we have you tell us a little bit about what you have here with the CD, but also what kind of work you're doing in general?
Right. Well, the work that I'm doing kind of comes in three areas. One, of course, as you mentioned, is the electroacoustic work that I do with my trumpet flugelhorn and working with composers that use analog and digital electronic music systems for electroacoustic works. And that's been a theme for a very, very long time. But before I go into that, the second area is an area called sound poetry or text sound composition. And that has been a focus of mine since the early 70s, early to mid 70s. Then the third area that I'm interested in is just as a trumpet player playing the entire literature, both old, new, and not yet composed music for the trumpet. Whereas I do play symphonic work, my love is in extended techniques and using the trumpet to produce sounds both electroacoustically and just acoustically that is unexpected at times, and certainly it's a path that's not trodden by a lot, but there are some luminaries that do trod that path. So there's the kind of three areas that I'm working in: the electroacoustic area, live electronics, and the tech sound area, and then just the acoustic trumpet extended to as far as it can go on my own and with others.
Yeah, this is really an interesting three legs to your artistic stool. I think it's pretty wild. Now, I have had opportunities to talk with people in the past about working with, combining typical acoustic instruments with electronic work. I did talk to Jeff Kaiser, who also is doing a lot of live electroacoustic work, but there seems to be relatively few brass players, really, that get into electronics. What is it that drew you into the combination of that as an acoustic instrument, but also adding electronics to the mix?
Well, I started performing with Alan Strange and Don Buchla and David Rosenboom, J.B. Floyd. Many of these names you know, I'm sure.
Right, absolutely.
Dan Lentz. Back in the early days where we would do live electroacoustic performances with in those days was analog systems. It was Buchla, it was Serge, it was Moog, it was,
right.
It was whatever. What I brought to the table at the time, because I was just learning the Synthy AKS system, what I brought to the table was I was a trumpet player. So I was welcome into the fold as a trumpet player with my sound being processed in real time. And that's what really got me into the electroacoustic world, was being able to get into a setting with this caliber of players playing on instruments that were really quite new in their day. I mean, I guess I can say that, we're talking about 1969, 1970, 71, 72.
You were watching them being invented, in fact.
Well, and, Don made my analog systems for me. I have a Buchla easel that he made for me as I joined the Electric Weasel Ensemble with Don and Alan and Pat. And then later on down the road, I have a large 200 system. So these were actually constructed, and I would say, okay, I want one of those and one of those, and put that in there for me and make sure that I can process my horn in real time. So that's how I got going. And we performed back in those days around the Bay Area, maybe one or two concerts a month, sometimes more. And took it on the road, went across the U.S., took it to Europe. The Weasels did a big tour in Europe where we hit most of the major cities and played for people all the way from Paris all the way up to Stockholm and Filkingen. Right. So that's what got me into it. And I have to credit Alan, my mentor and colleague who passed away in 2008, with keeping me hot for that.
Well, you've already dropped some really interesting nuggets about things you've done and places you've been. But before we get into that, I would like to hear a little bit about your complete background. Like, how did you get to be the musician you are? I mean, I see where these people would have taken you and really kind of move you forward. But like, how did you get into trumpet? Where did you study, and what kind of propelled you into working with these guys?
Well, where I come from is as a young trumpet player, I had a couple of teachers. And when I got to where I was to get my 2 degrees, San Jose State, where I did both a performance and a musicology degree, I was introduced pretty quickly to new music. And at that time, we're talking about Earl Brown, John Cage, of course, right, Bob Moran, and then later on, very, very early, John Adams. But, the New York school was very important then, and I began performing new music. We did one of the first performances in the Bay Area of In C, Terry Riley's piece. Right. This was right after the recording was made, so we're talking 69, 70. And that propelled me forward in new music. And then as I began my degree programs, I realized that I was more interested in an interdisciplinary degree rather than a straight music degree. So I went into sound poetry and was able to bring in a lot of different energies with that. There was performance energy, there was the literature energy, there was the text energy, whether that was literature or not, and there was the movements at the time that kind of wrapped around that. Besides the Dadaist and the Fluxus groups, going up to the 20th century, I was introduced to the sound poets that were actually working at the time, like Bernard Heidsieck in Paris, Henri Chopin in Ingatstone in England, Sten Hansen and Lars Gunnar Bodin in Sweden. So I was introduced to these people through the American tech sound composer Charles Amerkanian, and I realized that this was an area that I wanted to explore, that I could use my horn, I could use my voice, and I could use my electronics. And so that really pushed me through college and finished up with a degree. I wrote the first book in English on sound poetry, tech sound composition. That was back in the mid to late 70s. And that's kind of kept me going. So, from trumpet teachers, playing in symphonies, playing in chamber groups, and then playing in new music ensembles where I was able to actually explore new kinds of composition, new kinds of sounds, and new ways of approaching instruments, both from the physical aspect, approaching the instrument itself, but also from the electroacoustic aspect, where I'm taking my horn and I'm processing it through a number of different electronic instruments, at that time analog, but then, it's gone into the digital realms now. So that's kind of where I came from. And there was a huge push in the new music area very early on. My other teacher was Lou Harrison. He was actually on my thesis committee and really was very encouraging in the direction that I was going, along with Alan and Charles and a few others. So it's been kind of enrapturing and encompassing life in new music. And at that time, the ending of the 70s, I actually taught in the Interdisciplinary and Experimental Arts Department at San Francisco State. So I was actually able to carry that into some university teaching for a while.
Oh, that's awesome. Now, I have to wonder what it must have felt like at that time. I mean, you kind of came through the musical zone at a time of like fantastic change. I mean, in a way, the late 60s and the early 70s, if we look back at it now, it looks bizarre. The rapidity of change, but also sort of like the whole social upheaval that surrounded it. It just sort of like seemed like all ground was shaky ground at the time, and everything was up for a great big change. Is that what it felt like to you, or did it just feel like I'm exploring and I'm taking this route and whatever. I'm trying to get a sense of what that felt like when you're in the middle of, you have this new music ramming head on into these orchestral things, and also the electronics and things like text-based scoring and stuff, all hitting the musical landscape at the same time. Did it seem like an upheaval, or did it just seem like a natural evolution?
Well, because I am a student of music, historical student of music, it seemed to me like an evolution. But at the time, it was like a maelstrom. It was like it was like this swirling mass of sound and influences and people. It was the small group that I was involved with. We were all basically very happy doing this weird stuff. We were very happy being outsiders, which we were very much the outsiders at the time, mm-hmm. and we were very happy being explorers. But being a Gemini, I've always worked in many different worlds all at once. And 1 hour I would go in and play, orchestra or large ensemble, and I'd be playing the traditional composers of the 19th and 20th century. And then the next hour I would be playing a piece by Mauricio Kagel. You can imagine you had to kind of split your brain because you play your horn with certain techniques here, and then you kind of almost, you can just throw those out because you have to explore in a different direction there. So to answer your question, yes, I felt somewhat torn, but I loved it. I loved it. I felt like it really made the time. And of course, this was the time of civil rights, and this was the time of the Vietnam War. This was the time of marching and campuses getting closed down. So we actually used that energy in some of the pieces that we created and wrote in the various new music ensembles. I remember one where everybody was dressed in diapers, and on the back of the diapers would be the name of a country. And we got in this ring, this wrestling ring, and it was kind of a wrestle off. And the person that was left was this 300-pound friend of mine, a tuba player, and we were wrestling together. And on the back of his diaper it said USA. Uh-huh. And on the back of my diaper, I even forget what it was, but he creamed me, and so it was perfect for the time. And that's the kind of energies that was going on. So it's enough to slap you upside the head, of course. But you can imagine the positive energy that went with this for exploring. John Cage said, basically everything is music. Just open your ears. And I think when you learned that back in the late 60s and the early 70s, you had, that was a leg up. That was kind of a carte blanche to go in and explore, which is what we did, and it's what I did going into electroacoustic music at the time. First with the synthy, which is an English instrument from London, and then full bore on with Buchla. I kind of bypassed Moog. Right. I'm not a Moog guy. I love Moog instruments, but knowing Don and hanging out with Don and performing with Don so much, Don Buchla, I was around all of the instruments as they were being made, and that was mind-blowing.
Sure, I imagine. He's an incredible guy, but also did get a chance of seeing occasionally some real brilliance just roll right out of him. That's cool. So let's talk a little bit about each of these legs. And first of all, you said the first leg was your work with electroacoustics, and you specifically stayed with and live electronics. What exactly does that mean to you?
Well, it really means putting yourself on the line because you're out there. I do tape work also, and I have many different tape works that I've done in the studio.
Okay.
But and I enjoy that work a lot. But when you're performing live with electronics, you're doing more listening sometimes than playing, mm-hmm. Especially if it's a very complicated electronic setup where you're bringing in many voices and you're mixing them in real time. And then when you're playing over the top of that and processing your sound and mixing that with what's going on, and you're in surround sound, 8 channels, for example, which is what I'm performing in usually these days. It's a very complicated setup, and you're really focused on the sound product and where it's going and the balances and the timbre of that sound, and is it the right timbre that you want? And we're talking about electroacoustic sound. We're not just talking about the sound of a trumpet or a flugelhorn. So in live performance, many different things can happen in this particular genre of electroacoustic music, many things can happen that sometimes they're out of your control.
Right.
For example, my performing colleague and I, Brian Belet, in a group called Soundproof, we have a work that we call A Strange Diversion. It's kind of an homage to Alan. And I will feed Brian from my Buchla system. I will feed Brian segments of sound and pieces and phrases of things that are coming out, and then he will take those into a system called a Kima, and he will process them in real time. And sometimes he has random processing going on simultaneously. So there's 4, 5, 6 voices going out, or up to 8 voices if we're doing 8-channel sound, and we are never quite sure what's going to happen. Now we're since the pieces are pretty well mapped out and they are directed improvisations, to use one of Alan's terms, we have a grasp on the form and the grasp on the sections and what goes on in the sections. But underneath that and inside that, there'll be little things that happen that we could not have predicted. So that's where the risk factor comes in, because you got to make something with that, right? You have to, like in the old days when a patch cord would break, or a line stretched across the stage would break an audio cable, something drastic would happen, and you had to make music out of that. Well, It's not quite as bad as it was back in the old days when you were stretching 50 lines across the stage, and you had reel-to-reel tape recorders with loops going on. It's not that kind of crazy. But many times, in fact, we did Seamus. You mentioned Seamus. We just got back from Seamus up in Oregon about a month ago, and we did a piece, and it was a very different experience because some things happened that neither one of us expected. And so that's where the improvisation, where the skill in improvisation comes in. What are you going to do with it?
Right.
How are you going to make it interesting and within context, or totally without context and surprise yourself and the audience too?
Yeah, right. Because sometimes that kind of stuff can propel you in a direction you didn't exactly expect to go.
Exactly.
I know I've had a chance to do some of these what you call directed improvisations, and one of the things I note is that the interesting nature of it is almost proportional to the amount of risk that there is at play. Right? It's like if things are really well defined and well directed, in a way, it almost kind of loses a little bit of the edginess and the excitement. Where if you feel like you're on the edge, I think that's transmitted to people, and that adds to sort of like the excitement of the performance too, right?
It does. I mean, if you have something that's really perfect and everything flows exactly in some kind of predestined fashion, and everyone's sitting there shaking their heads up and down, yep, I see that, I expected that, that phrase is kind of tied off there, the next starts, and that, then it sounds like it might come out of a studio, right?
Right.
It's not, you lose that high wire act in performance, and you get that in all performance. I'm a symphony trumpet player, and we just did Mahler 1 a week ago. I'm principal in the symphony, so if you know about Mahler 1, you know that basically the last page of the score in Mahler 1 for the trumpet section, especially the principal trumpet player, is you're flat out, just flat out. Mm-hmm. And many things can happen when you're screaming over the top of the orchestra, and everyone else is kind of there with you. So it can happen in all settings, but it's predictive that it's going to happen. This kind of risk factor, high risk factor, when you're doing real-time electronic music or real-time electroacoustic music. And I'm not talking about melodic keyboard style, where everything is generated encapsulated within a scale or a chordal pattern, which, there's some really fine electronic music that's developed. But I'm talking about when you're creating sonic events, right, and you're matching those sonic events, and you're kind of contrasting and complementing each other, and you're letting them crash against each other, and you're moving them around the room in 4 different directions.
Well, I think that actually is really super apparent in your album. I mean, one of the things that I got out of your album was that you do extended technique stuff on the trumpet, which is interesting, but you don't do it in a way that sort of is like, hey, look at me, I'm doing a wacky thing with the trumpet. But instead, it's like, I mean, it really, even your trumpet playing a lot of times really sounds very synthesis-like, right? It
Mhm.
seems like they're like that, like even the tonality of a Buchla system has influenced your trumpet styling.
Well, it has, and of course, as you know, the Moog has a really kind of trademark sound.
Hmm.
The Buchla does too. When you hear a Buchla play, you can tell a Buchla. Well, after you've played performing on a Buchla for 30 years, you do have a sense, or more, you do have a sense of that sound, and it comes back to you all the time. I'm trying to extend that sound. For instance, you mentioned my CD. It's called Flamethrower, and it's on Ravello Records. There's two pieces by Alan Strange on there.
Right.
The first one is called Velocity Studies 5 Endgate. It's from a series of his that he started in 1987, and he's got 5 of these velocity studies. He waited 14 years between number 4 and number 5, and which is the Endgate one. And what he did was he stacked, and these are, by the way, this is all notated in traditional notation very precisely. He stacked 7 trumpets plus 2 obligato trumpets on top, and I had to go through in the studio, and for this piece, which is roughly 7 minutes long, I had to record each one of those tracks. There's three movements, attacca. I had to, and plus the 2 obligato trumpets, and then mix them in with the electronics that he created basically with Max MSP.
Okay.
So what you get is you get what Alan wanted, right? You get the sound that Alan wrote and all the notes that you wrote. And I hope you get a chance to play that, because it's such a rich piece. People listen to it and they're just astonished that the conglomerate sound, the aggregate sound can be the way it is. So that was one. The other one, totally different. It's called Misty Magic Land. The earlier piece that Alan composed in 2004 for me, that's kind of an ambient piece, right? And the score, rather than being notated out in the traditional notation, he's written it out in kind of visual notation, linear notation that allows me to make up what I want to play. I mean, he has some guidelines. You know, he said, don't do this, don't do that, kind of do this, do that, and then go. And so then you get this pad, this very ambient kind of new age pad, which Alan didn't do. This is a very different piece for him. And it allowed me just to kind of float in that pad with my horn, flugelhorn in this case, and be able to not only create some melodic material, but listening to the sounds that he created with his Max MSP system, and he used quite a few toys with this, and try to imitate some of that so that I'm blending into the orchestration.
Sure.
Misty Magic Land was a very different piece for Alan. I'm surprised that he would write it for me, because I don't think he ever heard me play a new age work, or maybe he did. Some of my early pieces were quite that way. But it's such an enjoyable piece to play, and it's the one that gets played the most because you can play it late at night and people dream off to sleep with it, and it's a lovely piece. Whereas the first piece, Endgate, is just total balls to the wall screamer. It just starts. Right. There's a middle section that's very lovely, as you know. It's all done. All the trumpets are done in harmon mute with the stem out. Stem is off.
Okay.
And so you get 7 layers plus 2, including the solo trumpet, all in harmon mute. And it's just the textures that he's created are just so lovely, very long, and then it goes back into this very fast allegro finale that just winds up with an explosion at the end. Right. So that was a very important piece. You know, he started that back in about 2007. He finished it in January 2008. And I came up to Bainbridge, where he was living, and we had a big concert up there where I performed his work, and also Brian Belet's piece, which is called System of Shadows, which is also on the CD. I performed it for him, and he passed away 6 weeks later. Oh. It was really tragic. He just kind of kept it together, because he's very ill with cancer. He kept it together for that concert, and I was able to perform that piece for him, and then when I was leaving, I didn't think I was going to see him again, and sure enough, February 20th of 2008, he passed on.
Interesting you talk about the different scoring techniques. Unfortunately, the scores for these aren't on the site, but you do have a couple of scores. You have November Twilight and System of Shadows. You have scores for those available on the
It's on the extended catalog site, right?
yeah,
Right.
which is actually really neat because I know when I'm teaching, sometimes I would like to show people like modern scoring techniques, and sometimes these scores aren't easily available, and so it's really neat to do those. I'll put a link on the show notes for people who want to both check out your album and dig further into the scores and stuff.
Right.
But what I noticed is the thing I really liked is the one that Elainie Lillios, is that how you say her name?
Elainie Lillios, yes.
Yeah. The one she did is actually an interesting thing because, first of all, there are kind of extensive notes on what she wanted in terms of a technical setup, which is
Yes.
pretty interesting because it's done in kind of generic fashion. So as technology changes, you can still kind of follow along. But I also really like the idea that she had sort of like this simultaneous mixture of both standard traditional notation and a more graphic notation, which
Hmm.
looked like it was really interesting, and it was a cool way to document, hey, let's do electronics, but here's sort of the arc I want you to follow. It looks like it was, I mean, it was really masterfully done, I thought.
Elainie and I worked on that for almost 2 years, back and forth. You know, she's a full professor of music at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and also the director of the electronic music studio there.
Right.
She heard me play Alan's piece. I think it was one year at ICMC back in New York, and that she came up and she said, "Okay, I want to write a piece for you." So we spent 2 years and we designed a vocabulary. So getting back to your point on the notation, if you when you look at the score, you find that she's asking for certain things for me to do. Well, the
Right.
way that she came up with those is we would be on the phone and she would say, "Now, what about if you do this? Can you give me a that? Is it possible to do a glissandi, a stepped glissandi up, and at the same time a vocal movement down? What happens if you move your valves like this and play that?" So what we did over a very long period of time is we developed a vocabulary with each one of these kinds of sounds. I would give her what she wants, and then we would give it a name together, and we
Okay.
had some pretty wild names for some of this stuff. Really wild names. Some of them are not too wild, but there was one thing that we called a balloon tone, a ricochet gliss, of course a flap tongue, a mouthpiece pop, and then we would bring out articulations that I hadn't even heard of
Right.
from God knows where. And so we developed an Excel spreadsheet, if you will, of about 50 different pieces, different vocabulary items. And then she would take those items and then decide how she wanted to use them in the arch of the piece. And then, of course, then on top of that, she would use her Max MSP patch and process those sounds while I was doing them in live. All of this piece is live. The processing is done live with an algorithm using Max MSP. I'm sure that many of your listeners will know what that is. And so she started sending me fragments. And then I started putting the fragments together, and I would record them and send them back to her. And we worked this way, and then we'd do a Skype like we're doing, like you and I are doing now.
Yeah.
And I would record things in my studio and send them to her, and then she would process them and send them back. And thus, November Twilight got put together like this with a text with a haiku text by Wally Swist. And it was just delightful working with Elainie. She is absolutely my favorite electroacoustic composer. Or as it's called in the business, acousmatic composer.
Right.
She's just a master at this. Her works are some of the finest acousmatic works that I've ever heard. And to have a piece that she wrote for me is all live with interactive electronics was superb. And I consider this to be kind of the centerpiece of the CD.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. But I'm always interested whenever I get a chance to ask people about collaboration. I do because there are so many different styles of collaboration. And this sounds really unique because you are kind of sharing multidimensionally, right? You'd talk things through, but you'd also this idea of building up a shared vocabulary.
Hmm.
That seems like a really, that's kind of like a cool elemental way to start the process. But then also sharing through those means. In the mechanism that you described, what was actually the hardest part of that collaboration?
As I'm looking here at the score, I think the hardest part of the collaboration was when she had finally put it all together and she said, okay, here's the score. Now I want you to do all these gestures, all these vocabulary elements, and we're going to be doing them. It's going to happen pretty quick. Boom, 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 boom. And so as you look at the score, you realize I'm having to do extended techniques every time I pick up the horn.
Right.
And I don't drop them. Of course, the piece, as your listeners will hear, is for these little finger cymbals called crotales, and it's for voice. There's a lot of sound poetry in this text sound composition where my voice, I'm actually performing extended techniques with my voice, and I'm being processed at the same time. And then trumpet, and I use a C trumpet on this, with and without a bunch of mutes that she wanted me to go through, because that was a whole other thing, developing a mute vocabulary.
Oh,
So the
right.
hardest thing was, okay, now you got to play it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we've done all of this research, all this fun stuff. Now you got to play it.
Well, and play it linearly. I mean, even when you look at it, you can kind of see the step-by-step approach to building this up. But then to do a linear performance, that had to be a little intimidating, right?
Well, at first it was, and she had a foot pedal for me so that I could actually move the Max MSP cues forward myself.
Ah, I see. Okay.
I was so busy. I'm so busy doing other things that I said, I don't want to think about one more limb pressing on something. I want you to do it. And so it's either Elainie that runs electronics for me, or Brian Belet, my performance partner,
Right.
that runs electronics for me. And I just concentrate on the notes that you see and trying to get that right.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you mentioned that this piece has like bridges into the world of sound poetry. For people that aren't familiar with that as a specific phrase, as a concrete concept, why don't you talk a little bit about what it represents to you?
Well, very briefly, sound poetry is the combination of text and music where they both inform each other. And we're not talking about art songs. We're talking about getting inside a word, getting inside the sound of a word, getting inside of how that word is made in your mouth or wherever you decide to make the word, and then being able to make a sonic gesture with that, and then stringing those together as you would in a composition. So there's many real-time sound poets that are working right now, like Jaap Blanc is a very famous one. Enzio Minarelli is another one that just do all of this with a microphone, and they go through the weirdest kind of vocal gymnastics, a la Henri Chopin and Bernard Heidsieck, two of the sound poets of the last century. Sound poetry goes all the way into electroacoustic processing with the Swedes. They had a school. There was a school in not a school, but a collection of artists in Stockholm that created this group called Fylkingen. And Fylkingen started as a performing arts group, and then gradually expanded itself into some experimental arts groups. Thus, you have electronic music studios, poets, vocalists, musicians working together to extend the voice. So any of these names that I've mentioned, you can go on to Uberoi or many other places on the web and listen to sound files from them. For me, sound poetry hit very, very early. I wrote my thesis on it, but even before I wrote my thesis on it, I was writing to the sound poets of the day and asking them the same question you just asked me. What is this? Where does it come from? Well, it goes all the way back to the Dadists and Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings and Zara, and that coterie of people around Zurich in the mid 1916, and then it goes back further to the Italian futurists like Marinetti, for example, and then it goes back even further to the Russian futurist Khlebnikov and his group of poets that extended poetry beyond just Mary had a little lamb, and the lamb fainted. It extends it much, much beyond that, so that you get the visceral sound of the voice, and you're telling stories with that. And of course, musicians picked up on that like crazy in the 1950s. Think of Berio with Amagio, Thema Amagio at Joyce, or Stockhausen and Stimmung, or Eimert, the epitaph for Akichi Kuboyama. Any of those pieces were done by musicians in electronic music studios. So it's really a crossover art. And for me, all of the composers knew that I do sound poetry. So Elainie chose to put that in. So did Bruno Liberta, which is his piece is called Sphere of Air is Bound. That's the second piece on the CD. And we use that to huge effect. That's the most abstract piece that's on there. And Bruno loved what I was doing with my voice. And so there's whole sections where I'm using my voice much like the way I would use my trumpet, extended techniques on the trumpet, and he's processing me. Again, this time with a system called a Kyma, Kyma. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but we're going to run out of time. But for his score is total graphic visual score. And I couldn't put this on there, unfortunately, just because of the size. He created little gestures on transparent overlays. And then he created another sheet with lines on it, and I would place the overlays on top of the lines and turn them, and that was my score. And there was 3 pages. One had little black images on there, another had little green images on there, one had little yellow, red, orange. And so when I was recording this for him, that's what I would just say, okay, so this is the black page, this is the orange page, this is the green page. And I would record all just an improvisation and send it to him, and then he would process it.
That's yet another cool documentational experience as well. Now, in looking at this the CD project, and again, I keep on coming back to that because it's got so many like fascinating angles to discuss. One of the things is it looks like it took you a long time to put this together. Right?
It took 8 years.
Yeah. What was it that like caused it to take that long? But also, what is it that allowed you to kind of like keep your momentum? Because I think a lot of people having an eight-year-long project is just almost unimaginable.
Yeah, very, very simply, these pieces were written for me over that period of time, the earlier period of time, and I didn't feel comfortable going into the studio and recording them until after I took them around the world. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
By taking them around and performing them in public. And then I would be able to modify my approach to a piece if I didn't see something that wasn't working. So each one of these pieces were played minimum of, half a dozen times each, except for Liberta's piece. You know, we did that in Vienna at the KISS, Kyma International Symbolic Sound event that happens every year. We did it there in Vienna. But everything else, Brian's piece, the last piece, System of Shadows, we worked on that for over 2 years, and we've performed that all over the world. And so that's what kept me going. Yes, what kept me going? Well, the fact is, I was performing these pieces over that period of time. And then I finally quit my day job. I worked in corporate America for software companies for quite a few years. And I finally was able to leave that behind and have enough little shekels put away in a pot. So that's when I went into the studio, did all the recordings, did all the mixing, did all the mastering. Fortunately, I had the record company approach me. They heard what I was doing with Elainie, and they went to Elainie and they said, well, Elainie, we want another acousmatic. And she goes, I just put one out. I don't have time. Talk to Stephen, and this is what he's doing. So Chris Robinson called me up from Parma Recordings and said, Elainie says you got this in the bag. And I go, well, I ain't got it in the bag yet, but it's getting there. So I had a record company in the background pulling for me to get it finished. And that was a huge impetus on the back side. So the impetus on the front side, I'm working with all these great composers. We're doing all this collaboratively. I take the pieces around the world and play them, get them to the point where I like them. And then I got a record company supporting, well, they didn't support me, I supported them. On the backside saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. My wife, Belinda Carr, is a photographer and a visual artist, so she developed all of the art for it and helped them with the packaging and what it was going to look like. And so it's just, in the back end, when people are flagging, I was just getting real excited because I was working with engineers, I was working with mastering engineers, I was working with the art people at Parma, and that kept the 8 years going.
Sure. Sure. Okay, so given that you have all these things, you're kind of you do have kind of all three of these things, not only holding up the stool, but really interacting with each other in a very extensive way. What do you see is a future for you? What's the next thing that you either add or you extend to your repertoire and your bucket of tools?
Well, Brian Belet and I are performing quite a bit together in this group called Soundproof, which also includes Pat Strange, the widow of Alan Strange. She's a fine new music fiddle player. Brian and I have got two series that we're performing. One I mentioned earlier, A Strange Diversion, which is Buchla and Kima. That continues to be developed, and I can see that I would like there to be a whole series of works based on that'll come out on recording, because there's a lot to be said about those pieces and how we use Buchla and the shaping of the Buchla sound with the Kima, and then the sound of the Kima system itself, the digital system. So that's one. And then the next thing, we have a series called, the one piece that we're performing now is called Tessellation Rag. And that's a live text sound work. And all this is on my SoundCloud, so you can go listen to it. And it uses the voice in the ways that I've talked about, in live performance being processed live. That's a series called Disconcerted Speech, with the current work on that series called Tessellation Rag. That I see as having legs to go forward and coming out with an entire collection of text sound works. So that's one area. And then the other area is simply to keep going with my horns and interactive electronics. So I'm encouraging composers out there to consider, after they've listened to Flamethrower, to get a hold of me, and I'm looking for pieces for Flamethrower too.
Well, that sounds awesome. Stephen, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this talk. It was really educational for me. I felt like I learned a lot. I hope the listeners did as well. The SoundCloud site that you just mentioned, where is that exactly?
I think it's called S-Ruppent 1, S-R-U-P-P-E-N-T 1, S-Ruppent 1, or under my full name, Stephen Ruppenthal.
Okay, I'll make sure that that's in the show notes as well. But also I want to make sure that people check out Ravello Records. Stephen's stuff is on there, but most people will find some really, really interesting work there. So I'm really glad that they picked you out, because it's a really great release, man.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm going to go let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon, okay?
Thanks, Darwin. Bye-bye.
Many thanks to Stephen for hanging out and have a chat. Make sure that you check out his album. It's on Ravello Records. That's Ravello Records. The name of the album is Flamethrower, Stephen Ruppenthal. It's really a lot of fun to listen to. I strongly recommend you check it out. Also, go on their site, look into the extended information. You'll actually get a chance to see some scores and stuff as well. Pretty amazing stuff. For other information about Stephen, just check our show notes. And with that, I'm going to let you go. I'm literally heading out the door to go on a little vacation here. So I'll talk to y'all when I get back, which will just be next week. So talk then. Bye.